I found that tax form on a Tuesday. Not a Tuesday marked by any calendar significance, just an ordinary Ohio Tuesday in April, the kind where the sky hangs low and grey, and the daffodils are trying to decide if frost will kill them. The mail came late that afternoon, a stack of catalogues and bills and one envelope from a company called Great Lakes Life Assurance, addressed to Alan Richard Morris, deceased, care of the basement suite of a 4-bedroom colonial in a Columbus suburb that I once called home. Inside was a $1,099 INT form, reporting interest income of $318 paid on a life insurance policy with a face value of $300,000, and the recipient name was not mine. It was hers. Claire Elaine Bates, the stepdaughter I had raised from a skinny 6-year-old with missing front teeth into a college graduate with a degree in marketing, and an appetite for things that did not belong to her. That single sheet of paper, slightly curled from humidity and smelling faintly of stale air, would unravel a decade of deception, ignite a forensic investigation that would span 3 states, send a woman I once called my daughter to federal prison, and end with me holding the deed to the very house where I had been a servant in the basement. Today I collect rent from Diane, her biological mother, the same woman who called me a liar to my face in a courtroom hallway, and every check she hands me is a receipt I keep in a locked drawer next to the key to Alan's wooden box. That key and the box it opened started everything, and I am going to tell you exactly how the quiet, patient engine of truth ground forward, one methodical step at a time. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that the truth, no matter how long it takes to surface, always finds its way into the light. I grew up in a small steel town in eastern Ohio, the kind of place where the tallest structure was the water tower, and the loudest sound was the shift change whistle at the mill. The air always carried a faint metallic tang, and in winter the snow piled grey along the streets while the blast furnaces glowed orange on the horizon. My father, a soft-spoken man who had worked in the galvanizing department for 19 years, came home the day the mill closed in 1982 with a cardboard box of his locker contents, a thermos, a pair of work gloves worn smooth, a small framed photo of my mother, and a service pin that marked 2 decades nearly complete. I was 14 years old, sitting at the kitchen table doing algebra homework, and I watched him set the box down. He sat without speaking for 2 hours, his hands flat on the formica, staring at the grain. My mother, a home health aide who changed bedpans and bathed elderly clients for minimum wage, simply put her hand on his shoulder and went back to stirring the soup. The smell of chicken broth and celery filled the room, and I watched her add a single extra potato to stretch the meal. I learned something that afternoon, watching the steam rise from the pot and the weight descend on my father's shoulders. Money is not just currency. It is safety, it is dignity, and it can be ripped away from you by forces you never see coming. From that day on, I understood that every dollar had to be earned carefully, guarded fiercely, and spent only when necessary. I kept a mental ledger of every lesson my parents taught without words. Patch the knees of your jeans before buying new ones, turn off lights when you leave a room, grow vegetables in the backyard because the grocery store is a luxury. My mother would sit at the kitchen table with a stack of bills and a checkbook, her lips moving silently as she calculated, and I would watch her face relax only when the numbers balanced. That was the inheritance I received, a bone-deep understanding that financial security was a fragile structure you had to build and maintain every single day. I put myself through the local community college working nights as a cashier at a Kroger, standing on my feet until 11, and then studying until 2 in the morning with a cup of instant coffee. I transferred to Kent State University's nursing program and financed it by working as a patient care tech at a Cleveland hospital, a job that paid $9 an hour and taught me the architecture of human suffering. I emptied catheter bags, turned 300-pound patients to prevent pressure sores, and held the hands of strangers as they died because their families could not get there in time. I memorized the way a patient's pulse changes when fear sets in, the way skin temperature drops before shock, the way a person's eyes can tell you more than a monitor. It was hard, grinding work, but it reinforced something essential. I could endure. By the time I was 32, I was a registered nurse on a cardiac telemetry floor, making $57,000 a year before overtime. I was not glamorous. I drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic with a passenger door that would not open from the inside, and a driver's side window that stuck halfway down in the winter. I packed my lunches in Tupperware containers that my mother had used before me, the plastic stained orange from decades of tomato sauce, and I tracked every expense in a spiral notebook, the ink fading over the years but the columns always balanced. Every paycheck I divided into categories: rent, utilities, groceries, car maintenance, retirement. I never carried a credit card balance. I never bought anything I could not afford in cash. My checking account had a steady cushion. My 403b retirement account grew by $100 a month, and I felt a quiet, unshakable pride in that. I had built a life on the principle that if you worked hard and sacrificed for the right reasons, things would be okay. I still remember the first time I opened a retirement account statement and saw compound interest working in my favor, pennies adding up to dollars, and I thought of my father and his cardboard box. I was never going to let that happen to me. His name was Alan Morris. He taught sophomore biology at the local high school, a man of 43 with gentle brown eyes and a voice that never rose above a calm murmur. We met at a back-to-school health fair where I was running the blood pressure station. I remember the way he sat down, rolled up his sleeve, and looked at me with a kind of weary kindness, the look of someone who had been doing the emotional heavy lifting for too long. His blood pressure was slightly elevated, 140/90, and when I asked about stress, he gave a small, rueful laugh and told me about his 6-year-old daughter Claire. When he talked about her, his voice softened into something almost reverent, and I could hear the exhaustion beneath it. His ex-wife Diane had left him 2 years earlier, moving to Florida with vague promises about real estate potential and a new boyfriend who owned a boat. She visited Claire once a year if the flights were cheap, and the rest of the time Alan was mother and father both. He told me once that he had learned to braid hair from a YouTube video and that he still burned pancakes every Saturday because Claire liked them crispy on the edges. The first time I met Claire, she was sitting at Alan's kitchen table drawing a picture of a horse with a purple crayon. She looked up at me with serious grey eyes, studied my face for a long moment, and then said, "Do you know how to draw a saddle?" I didn't really, but I sat down beside her and tried, and something shifted in the room. Alan stood in the doorway watching us, and I could feel the hope radiating off him like heat from a wood stove. We dated for 18 months carefully, because I was not going to be the woman who barreled into a half-formed family without understanding the full weight of it. I learned that Alan was drowning in debt, his ex-wife having maxed out joint credit cards before she left, and medical bills from his father's stroke years earlier still lingering like a bad smell. He was paying $200 a month on a debt that never seemed to shrink, and the interest alone was eating him alive. I reviewed the statements with him one evening at that same kitchen table, and I saw the anxiety in his shoulders. He had been carrying this alone, and he was not a man who could ask for help. When we got married at the courthouse on a Wednesday afternoon in October, with Claire wearing a dress she picked out herself and holding a small bouquet of daisies, I sold my small condo and used the $32,000 in equity to wipe out every single one of those debts. I wrote the check at the kitchen table, the same table where Claire had drawn her horse and Alan cried. He was not a man who cried easily, but he put his head down on his arms and sobbed, and I held him and told him it was going to be different now. I did not regret a single cent of that money. I loved him. I loved the family we were building. That night I added a new section to my spiral notebook, family expenses, future college fund, and I started running projections. I wanted Claire to have what I had not, a path through school unburdened by debt. I opened a $529 college savings plan the next week, depositing the first $100, and I made a promise to myself that no matter what, that account would grow. Claire became mine in every way that mattered. I never formally adopted her, although Alan offered and I considered it, but the legal paperwork felt less important than the day-to-day reality. I was the one who drove her to school every morning, the Honda's heater barely working, and I would watch her run up the steps with her backpack bouncing. I braided her hair for picture day, my fingers clumsy at first but eventually practiced, learning the tight French braid she liked. I sat up with her through the night when she had stomach flu, holding a bucket and singing off-key lullabies I remembered from my mother. I was the one who sat at the kitchen table with her through algebra tears, explaining the distributive property over and over until she could see it, and I was the one who taught her to parallel park in the high school parking lot on a Sunday afternoon, gripping the dashboard and praying for the tires. I remember the first time she called me Mom, not as a slip but as a choice. She was 8 and I was making grilled cheese sandwiches and she said, "Mom, can I have the crusts cut off?" I turned around so she wouldn't see me cry. I took her shopping for her first prom dress at a resale shop because money was tight, a blue satin thing that needed alterations, and when the strap tore the night before the dance, I stayed up until 2 in the morning sewing it back on with tiny, careful stitches, my nursing fingers still deft even when exhausted. I cooked dinner 6 nights a week after 12-hour shifts, washing my hands raw before I touched the lettuce, and I never missed a school play, a parent-teacher conference, or a cross-country meet. I kept a shoebox full of her school photos, art projects, and report cards, and I wrote notes on the back of each one. Claire, age 10, won the spelling bee. Claire, age 12, solo in the spring concert. That shoebox lived in my closet, and I would sometimes flip through it when I needed to remind myself why I worked so hard. Alan's salary as a teacher was static, locked into a pay scale that crawled upward at 2% a year while inflation chewed at the edges. My nursing income was the engine that powered our family. When the transmission in the minivan died, I paid for the rebuild. When the roof leaked during a spring storm, I wrote the check for $3,700 without blinking. When the water heater failed, I called the plumber and stood there while he worked, mentally calculating how many extra shifts it would take to refill the emergency fund. I did these things because that was what you did for family. You sacrificed, you showed up, and I was good at it. The college years were the apex of that sacrifice. Claire was a bright girl, motivated and capable, and she had her heart set on Ohio University. The tuition, room, and board came to about $25,000 a year, and Alan's savings bond was worth $4,000. The rest was on us, and by us I meant me. I ran the numbers on a yellow legal pad, plugging figures into a spreadsheet I built myself, because I had become the family's de facto accountant. I calculated that if I picked up 2 extra shifts a week, every week for 4 years, and if we lived leaner than we already did, we could cover it without loans. That meant 72 hours a week on my feet, sometimes more, the soles of my nursing clogs wearing thin and my lower back aching in a permanent knot. I would come home at 8 in the morning after a double shift, shower off the smell of antiseptic and illness, and sleep for 5 hours before getting up to make dinner. I learned to fall asleep anywhere, on a break room cot, on the living room couch with my shoes still on. I packed lunches in the same Tupperware containers, wore scrubs until they frayed, and deferred my own dental work for 3 years because a root canal could wait, and Claire's sociology textbook could not. I remember standing in the grocery store comparing prices per ounce on peanut butter, while my jaw throbbed with the abscess I was ignoring. Over 4 years I drained $140,000 from my earnings, routing it through the 529 plan and then straight into the bursar's office. I kept a running tally in my notebook, not out of resentment, but out of the same meticulous habit I applied to everything. I never asked for thanks, and I did not expect it. I was investing in her future, and I did it with love. The day of her graduation, I sat in the folding chairs under the spring sun with my feet aching in resale shop heels, and I watched her walk across the stage in a cap and gown with 0 debt and a degree in marketing. Alan held my hand, and I cried quietly, thinking this was the payoff for all those double shifts and missed meals and the root canal I still needed. That night I finally made the dentist appointment, and when the dentist asked why I had waited so long, I told him my daughter needed a textbook. He looked at me for a long moment and then gave me a 10% discount. Claire moved to Columbus for a job at a boutique marketing agency, and we saw her on holidays. She seemed happy, driven, and she had met a man named Mark. Mark ran a small car detailing business, which he described with great enthusiasm as a scalable asset with passive income uplines, words that made Alan raise an eyebrow, but that I tried to interpret charitably. They got married in a small ceremony at a vineyard, and I wore a dress I found on clearance at a department store, and I told myself that this was the natural arc of things. The child you raise flies the nest and builds her own life, and you step back and let her. I was content to do that, even if the distance between us was growing in ways I could not quite name. Mark wore shiny shoes and talked a lot about leverage and franchising, and I noticed that they leased a BMW and bought a timeshare in Fort Myers, but I bit my tongue. Alan was still teaching, I was still nursing, and our life was simple and good. We had started a small garden in the backyard, tomatoes and zucchini and herbs, and on summer evenings we would sit on the porch and listen to the cicadas. Alan was the kind of man who found joy in small things, the first ripe tomato of the season, the way the morning light hit the maple tree. I thought we had decades left. I thought the hardest part was over. Then Alan got sick. It started with a cough in February of his 52nd year, a dry, persistent rasp that he blamed on chalk dust and the dry air in his classroom. I listened to his lungs with my stethoscope one night, the same stethoscope I used at work, and I heard a faint wheeze in the right upper lobe, something subtle but wrong. I am a cardiac nurse, not an oncologist, but I have listened to thousands of chests, and I know the difference between a benign rattle and something that whispers malignancy. I told him to see his doctor, and he did, reluctantly, because he was a man who did not like to complain. The chest X-ray showed a shadow, and the CT scan revealed a mass in his right bronchus. The biopsy came back adenocarcinoma, stage 4 non-small cell, already metastasized to the lymph nodes. The oncologist sat us down in a small, windowless room and said the words median survival of 8 to 14 months with aggressive treatment, and I felt the floor tilt under my chair. I remember the color of the walls, a pale institutional green, and the way the fluorescent light buzzed faintly. Alan squeezed my hand, his fingers already thinner than they had been a month earlier, and he said, "Okay, what do we do now?" That was him. Steady, practical, even in the face of the unimaginable. I took a leave of absence from the hospital, burning through my accumulated sick leave, and then going part-time without pay, because I was not going to let him die with strangers. I managed his medications, a rotating schedule of chemotherapy drugs and anti-nausea pills and pain medications, each one timed precisely, and documented in a binder I kept on the kitchen counter. I learned to administer his feeding tube when the chemo wrecked his swallowing, a plastic tube that snaked through his nose and down into his stomach, and I mixed the nutritional formula myself because the premixed stuff was expensive and I could stretch our resources further. I kept a log of every calorie, every milliliter of fluid, every bowel movement, the same way I charted for patients, but with a tenderness that made my chest ache. I coordinated with the hospice nurse when the oncologist said there was nothing more to do, and I turned our bedroom into a makeshift hospital room with a rented bed and a pulse oximeter and a morphine pump that clicked softly through the night. Alan's body shrank, his skin turning papery and translucent, but his mind stayed sharp until the very end. He would lie in that bed, his hand in mine, and talk about the garden we never planted, the trips we never took, and his absolute, unwavering faith that I would be all right. He told me stories about his childhood, about fishing with his grandfather, about the way his mother sang hymns while she ironed. I listened and catalogued every word. I wrote some of them down in the back of my spiral notebook so I would never forget. 2 weeks before he died, on a Thursday morning when the sun was slanting through the window and the birds were loud in the maple tree outside, Alan took my hand in his thin fingers and told me he had updated his life insurance policy. The words came out slowly, each one a small effort. "It's $300,000, he said. "You are the sole beneficiary. I signed the paperwork with the agent in the room. Promise me you'll use it to take care of yourself. Don't let anyone else get their hands on it." His eyes held mine with a clarity that cut through the morphine fog, and I promised him. I kissed his forehead, dry and cool, and I said, "I promise, Alan, I will be okay." He died 6 days later, on a Wednesday afternoon in April, with the window open because he wanted to hear the birds. I was holding his hand, and the pulse oximeter flatlined with a soft, continuous tone, and I sat there for 20 minutes before I could bring myself to call the funeral home. I remember the sound of the birds. I remember the stillness of his chest. I remember the way the world contracted to a single point of grief, and then expanded again into a vast, empty room I did not know how to occupy. That night, after the funeral home had taken his body, I walked through the house and touched his things, his glasses on the nightstand, his favorite coffee mug with the chip in the handle, the book he had been reading with the bookmark still in place. I thought I had never known such loneliness. The vultures circled before I had even finished making the funeral arrangements. Claire drove up from Columbus the next morning with Mark beside her in the leased BMW, and when they walked through my front door, I could feel the air change. Claire was 28 years old, polished to a high gloss, wearing a charcoal blazer and carrying a leather planner like a corporate executive. Her hair was perfectly blown out, her makeup was flawless, and her expression was one of brisk, efficient sympathy. Mark was behind her in a polo shirt and khakis, carrying a laptop bag and wearing an expression of serious importance. They hugged me briefly and Claire said, "Oh, Mom, we're so sorry," the word Mom sliding off her tongue with a practiced ease that felt suddenly hollow. Mark brought a casserole from a local deli, a heavy dish of chicken and rice that I later threw away uneaten because grief had stripped me of appetite. Within 4 hours, they had taken over the kitchen table, the same table where I had taught Claire algebra and sewn her prom dress strap, and they spread it with stacks of documents and legal pads. Claire kept saying things like, "We need to get ahead of this," and "Mom, you're in no state to handle the administrative burden." She opened a bottle of my wine without asking, poured herself a glass and began making lists: probate, insurance claims, real estate, power of attorney. Mark made phone calls in the other room, his voice low and urgent, talking to someone he called his asset recovery contact, A man who could help us navigate the estate process. I sat on the sofa in my bathrobe with a cup of tea that had gone cold, watching them dismantle my grief into a spreadsheet. At one point, Claire looked at me and said, "Don't worry, Mom, we're going to take care of everything." The words were meant to comfort, but they landed like a threat. I remember thinking that they had not asked me a single question about Alan, not about his last days, not about what he said, not about how I was holding up. Their concern was administrative. That evening, after they left to check into a nearby hotel, I wandered through the quiet rooms of the house. The silence was thick, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the distant tick of the clock in the hallway. I found myself in Alan's study, a small back bedroom he had converted into a workspace years earlier. His desk was still covered with papers, graded biology quizzes with his red pen marks, and his bookshelf held the familiar collection of biology textbooks and field guides. A filing cabinet in the corner was stuffed with years of unsorted documents. On the floor by the closet, half hidden behind a stack of old magazines, was a small wooden box about the size of a shoebox, with a brass clasp and a faded patina that spoke of decades. I recognized it as his grandfather's old keepsake box, a thing that had lived on his dresser for most of our marriage, but which had migrated to the study sometime during his illness. Claire had picked it up earlier that day while they were rifling through things, shaken it dismissively, and set it on top of a pile of items destined for goodwill. "Old junk," she had muttered, not meeting my eyes. I retrieved it now, the wood smooth and cool under my fingers. The clasp was not locked. Inside there were a few sepia-toned photographs of Alan's grandfather, a silver dollar from 1921, a war medal with a faded ribbon, and a sealed envelope with my name on the front in Alan's distinct, shaky hand. The envelope was heavy, the paper thick, and I opened it with trembling fingers. The letter inside was brief, written in the jagged cursive of his final weeks, the letters slanting and uneven but still legible. It read, "My love, if you are reading this, I am gone. I have done everything I can to protect you. The policy is in your name. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise. Trust your instincts and trust the documents, not the people." At the bottom, he had added a string of numbers and letters, a combination, I realized, for something I did not yet know existed. I studied the handwriting for a long time, tracing the letters with my fingertip. The ink was blue, the kind from a ballpoint pen we kept in the kitchen drawer. Even through the shakiness, I could see Alan's determination in the way he pressed down on certain words. Protect, documents, not the people. I folded the letter carefully, tucked it back into the envelope, and hid the box in the crawl space behind the furnace in the basement, a spot I knew Claire and Mark would never think to look. My hands were shaking, but my mind was beginning to clear, the way a patient's vitals stabilize after a crisis. Alan had left me a warning, and I was just lucid enough to hear it. The funeral was 4 days later, a small service at the local funeral home with a pastor who barely knew Alan and a spray of white lilies that the funeral director had overcharged for. Claire gave a eulogy that was full of air and vagueness, a speech about a father who was her hero, a man who had always supported her dreams and who would want her to be happy now. She spoke for 7 minutes and did not mention my name once. Mark stood beside her, nodding at appropriate intervals, his phone buzzing in his pocket every few minutes. Diane, Alan's ex-wife, flew in from Florida, and when she walked into the funeral home in a pink pantsuit that was entirely too bright for an Ohio spring, I felt a cold prickle at the back of my neck. She looked preserved, like fruit dipped in shellac, with frosted hair that had been shellacked into a helmet and a smile that did not reach her eyes. She hugged Claire tightly, shot me a glance of pure, distilled contempt, and then spent the reception working the room like a politician at a fundraiser, telling anyone who would listen that she and Alan had never really stopped loving each other, that she was the true love of his life, and that it was a shame he had been isolated from his real family in his final years. I sat in the back row, next to a cousin of Alan's who squeezed my hand and said nothing, and I let the words wash over me because I had no energy left to fight. But I remember thinking, watching Diane's performance, that something was deeply, systemically wrong. This was not just grief. This was a play, and I was the audience they needed to convince. A week after the funeral, Claire and Mark sat me down at the kitchen table again, and this time Diane was with them, perched on a chair with a stack of old photo albums she had supposedly brought to go through from memories. The real agenda became clear within minutes. Mark spread several documents across the table like a card dealer, and Claire leaned forward, her voice soft and persuasive. "Mom," she said, "you shouldn't be alone in this big house, not at your age. It's too much to maintain. We want you to come live with us. We have a finished basement suite with its own bathroom and a little kitchenette. You'd be independent, but we could take care of you." Mark added smoothly, And it would make financial sense. You could sell this place and the money could help fund your retirement. We're family, it's what Alan would have wanted. Diane smiled, a tight, saccharine smile, and said, Claire feels responsible for you, Susan, it's the right thing. Then they produced a document, a durable general power of attorney, giving Claire the authority to handle all my financial affairs, including real estate transactions, bank accounts, and insurance claims. Just sign this so we can file the paperwork and manage the estate, Claire said, her tone light, as if she were asking me to sign a permission slip for a school field trip. I looked at the form, and something cold settled in my stomach. I had been a nurse for 20 years and I knew what standard medical consent forms looked like. This was not standard. This was comprehensive, sweeping, and it gave away everything. I recognized the language: full power to sell, convey, encumber, or otherwise dispose of any and all real and personal property, and I knew what it meant. It meant I would own nothing, control nothing. I told them I was too tired to read it right then, that I would look at it tomorrow. Claire's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, a flicker at the corner of her mouth. Mark said, Of course, take your time. We just don't want any delays with the insurance claims or the house. The house. My house, the home I had paid for month after month, suddenly a claim to be managed by people who had never made a mortgage payment in their lives. After they left, I went to the crawl space, retrieved the wooden box, and read Alan's letter again. Trust the documents, not the people. I made a decision that night. I would not sign anything until I understood exactly what was happening, and in the meantime I would play a part. Over the following weeks I let them believe I was overwhelmed and compliant. I would appear confused, grateful, a doddering widow who could not manage her own checkbook. When Claire called to talk about selling the house, I would say, Oh, I don't know, dear, it's all so complicated, and let my voice trail off. When Mark talked about the efficiency of consolidating assets, I would nod and say, You're so smart about these things, I'm lucky to have you. It was a calculated performance, and it made my skin crawl, but it worked. They stopped pressing so hard. They relaxed into the assumption that I was a passive asset to be managed. 3 months after Alan's death, I sold the house. I was genuinely exhausted, emotionally wrung out, and the thought of maintaining the property alone felt insurmountable. Claire and Mark helped me find a realtor, and they were all smiles when the sale went through, netting me $112,000 after the mortgage was paid. They took me out to dinner to celebrate, and Claire raised a glass and said, Now we can all be a family. The words stuck in my throat like a fishbone. I moved into their basement suite 2 weeks later with my small collection of belongings and the wooden box hidden at the bottom of a suitcase, and the next decade of my life began. Let me describe that basement. It was a finished space with low ceilings, a small window that looked out onto the lawn at ground level, and a perpetual smell of damp concrete that no air freshener could mask. The carpet was industrial grey, the walls a pale beige that had been painted hastily, and the light fixture buzzed faintly if you left it on too long. The kitchenette had a 2-burner hot plate, a miniature refrigerator that hummed all night, and a sink that dripped unless you turned the handle with a particular wrist motion. The bathroom was compact but functional, with a shower that never quite got hot enough. I made it as comfortable as I could, hanging a few photographs of Alan and my parents, arranging my books on a cheap shelf, and placing a small vase on the windowsill where I sometimes put wildflowers from the yard. But the claustrophobia was not about the square footage. It was about the weight of the house above me, the constant footfalls and vacuuming and television noise that filtered down through the floorboards. I lived there, but I did not belong there. I was a tenant, a guest, and increasingly an employee. Claire and Mark had 2 children over the next several years, a boy and a girl, and I became the default unpaid childcare. They would ask me to watch the kids on short notice, sometimes for entire weekends, while they attended marketing conferences or investment retreats in Florida. I picked up dry cleaning, let the plumber in, accepted packages, and folded laundry. I cooked meals for the family sometimes, using my own groceries, and they never thought to reimburse me. I was a live-in servant, invisible and useful, and I let them believe that was the full extent of my existence. I remember one Christmas morning, sitting in the basement while the family opened gifts upstairs, and I had not been invited to join them. I heard the children laughing, and I held Alan's wooden box in my lap and thought about the letter inside. I was not forgotten. I was waiting for something, and I did not yet know what it was. But I was watching. A nurse is trained to observe, to notice the subtle changes in a patient's condition, the pattern of a fever, the irregularity of a heartbeat. I applied that same clinical attention to the household above me. Mark's phone calls, which I could sometimes hear through the heating vents, were increasingly frantic. He would pace in the garage, his voice rising and then dropping into a low, urgent murmur, words like liquidity and rollover and collections floating down through the ducts. The car detailing business, which he had talked about with such grandiosity, seemed to be in trouble. I found a notice from a bank about a pending lien when I was sorting the recycling one morning, a thin slip of paper that suggested they were 2 payments behind on a line of credit. And yet the lifestyle continued unabated. New furniture arrived regularly, still in plastic wrap. The children were enrolled in private music lessons and equestrian camps. Claire went to the salon every 2 weeks, and the packages from online retailers piled up on the front porch like snowdrifts. The math did not add up, and I am very good at math. I kept a mental spreadsheet of their spending versus the income they claimed, and the deficit grew larger every month. I heard Claire on the phone one night, her voice strained, saying, "I don't know how much longer we can keep this going." I filed that away. The basement became my listening post, my observation deck. I learned the rhythms of their days, the times when they were both out, the particular creak of the second-floor hallway that signaled someone was in the master bedroom. I noted which bills arrived and which seemed to pile up unopened. I was a ghost in my own life, but a ghost with a purpose. The 10 years passed in a kind of suspended animation. I maintained my own small routines. A garden plot along the side of the house where I grew tomatoes and basil, a public television habit, a careful, frugal budget that let me stretch my savings and survivor benefit. My nursing license lapsed eventually because I could not summon the energy to renew it, and I did not need to work. But I was not idle. I was a sleeper agent in my own life, aware that something was deeply wrong and waiting for the moment when the fracture would become visible. I reread Alan's letter every few months, the paper growing soft at the creases, and I memorized the combination he had left. I began to suspect that the insurance policy had not been what Alan believed, but I had no proof. I waited. Waiting was something I had learned to do. Years of sitting with patients as their fevers broke or their pain eased. I could be patient. I had all the time in the world. That moment arrived on a Tuesday morning in April, exactly 10 years after Alan's death. Claire had deposited a plastic bin full of tax documents in my lap the night before, with the same casual entitlement she now used for everything. "Mom, you're so good at this stuff. Can you just organize it for the accountant?" I'm swamped. I took the bin without comment, because by then I had perfected the art of compliant invisibility. That morning I sat at my small Formica table and began sorting. I had always done the family taxes when Alan was alive, and I had a method. Separate the W-2s and 1099s, match them to the returns, look for anomalies. I was leafing through a stack of old 1099 INT forms from various banks when I saw it. Great Lakes Life Assurance, 1099 INT, payer's federal ID number, recipient, Claire Elaine Bates, social security number ending in 3378, interest income, $318, tax year, the year Alan died. I stared at that form for a very long time, my heart slamming against my ribs. Alan had told me I was the sole beneficiary of a $300,000 policy with that company. He had been explicit, insistent. So why was interest income being reported to Claire? The interest meant a payout had occurred, a lump sum large enough to generate taxable interest, and Claire had received it. The room seemed to tilt. I felt the same sensation I had felt in the oncologist's office, the floor shifting beneath me. I did not panic. I was a nurse, and I knew how to be steady when the body wanted to run. I made a cup of tea, Earl Grey, and sat down with the form and the corresponding tax return. The interest income was reported on Schedule B, buried among other small amounts. It had been filed jointly by Claire and Mark with all the proper signatures. They had received the payout, they had reported the interest, and I had never seen a cent of it. I set the tea down, took 3 slow breaths, and began to think like a detective. I remembered my training. Assess the situation, gather data, form a hypothesis, test it. I would need to be methodical. The first thing I did was call Great Lakes Life Assurance. I did not call from the basement phone because I didn't want a record on the household line extension that Claire or Mark might see. I walked to the public library, 1.5 miles in the grey spring damp, past the subdivision's manicured lawns and the playground where I had once pushed the grandchildren on swings. The library was a squat brick building with a hushed interior and the smell of old paper. I used a private study carrel with a phone jack, the kind with a heavy dial tone that sounded like it came from another era. I dialed the customer service number on the 1099 form, and when a woman answered, I gave Claire's name, her social security number, her date of birth and her address, all of which I had memorized from years of seeing her mail. I said I was Claire Bates, and I needed information on an old policy for some financial planning. The representative, a friendly woman named Cheryl, verified a few security questions that were embarrassingly easy to answer if you knew the person. Her mother's maiden name. I knew Diane's maiden name was Henderson. Her high school mascot, the Bulldogs. Her first pet's name, a cat named Mittens, from the vet records I had kept. Cheryl pulled up the policy. She told me the insured was Alan Richard Morris, policy number ending in 8824, face value $300,000. The original beneficiary, she said, was me, Susan Marie Morris. But a change of beneficiary form had been submitted and processed approximately 6 weeks before Alan's death, naming Claire Elaine Bates as the sole beneficiary. The change form required my signature as the original beneficiary, consenting to the change, and that signature was on file. Cheryl offered to mail a copy of the document for a $20 fee. I gave her the basement address and I hung up the phone. My hand was steady, but my pulse was hammering. I sat in the library for another hour, letting the rage settle into something cold and organized. Someone had forged my signature. Someone had sat down with a pen and stolen $300,000 from me, and the only someone who made sense was the woman who called me Mom. I walked home, my legs moving mechanically, and when I got to my basement I retrieved the wooden box from its hiding place and read Alan's letter yet again. Trust the documents, not the people. He had known. Maybe not the exact mechanism of the theft, but he had sensed the shape of it, the greed coiled inside his own daughter, and he had left me the tools. I read the combination again, a string of numbers and letters that I had now memorized, and I felt a grim resolve settling in. The packet arrived 2 weeks later, a thick manila envelope from Great Lakes Life's compliance department. I opened it at the library, because I could not risk it being intercepted at the house. Inside was a copy of the entire policy file, including the original application, the beneficiary designation naming me, and the change form. The form was dated October of that final year, about 4 weeks after Alan's diagnosis, but while he was still at home and not yet on heavy medication. The handwriting on the form was a chaotic mess. Alan's signature was a jagged, unsteady scrawl, the letters slanting and uneven, the way his hand had looked in those months. I recognized it immediately from the dozens of medical consent forms I had signed with him. But the signature under consent of current beneficiary, the one that was supposed to be mine, was wrong. I am not a professional forensic document examiner, but I have spent decades reading doctors' chicken-scratch handwriting and nurses' notes, and I can spot the difference between a natural hand and a simulation. My signature has certain effortless characteristics. The initial S loops in a particular way, the crossing of my T in Morris has a distinct backslant, and the pressure of the pen is light because I am a fast writer. The signature on that form was too careful, too deliberate. The pen pressure was heavy, like someone pressing down to control the line. The formation of the letter M in Morris was completely different from my natural hand, the humps too round, the baseline uneven. I stared at it for 10 minutes, committing every detail to memory. Then I photocopied the entire packet at the library copier, returned the originals to their envelope, and hid them in the crawl space behind a loose panel I had discovered near the furnace. I went home and began building a case. I needed an expert, and I needed an attorney. I remembered a woman named Patricia Hammond, an elder law attorney I had met years earlier through a charity event at the hospital. She had spoken on a panel about financial exploitation of the elderly, and I had kept her card in my wallet for nearly a decade, never knowing why. I called her from the library, her office number I had found in an old phone book, and she agreed to see me the following week. Patricia was 67 years old with short grey hair, a voice like gravel, and a mind that operated with surgical precision. Her office was in a small downtown building in Canton, the walls lined with law books and the air smelling of coffee and old paper. I laid out everything I had, the tax form, the policy file, the forged signature, Alan's letter. Patricia listened without interrupting, her eyes sharp behind reading glasses, and when I finished she set her pen down and said, "Susan, this is insurance fraud. It's a federal crime because the insurance company operates across state lines. We need a forensic document examiner, and then we go to the company and potentially the FBI. Are you prepared for what that means? The people you live with will face prison time." I told her I was. That word, prison, sat in the air between us like a stone, but I was ready. She added, "And if you're right, there may be other victims. Financial predators rarely stop at one." That thought had not occurred to me, but it hardened my resolve further. Patricia gave me the name of Dr. Leela Chen, a forensic document examiner in Akron with 30 years of experience and a wall full of certifications. American Board of Forensic Document Examiners, American Society of Question Document Examiners, a Fellow of the Question Document Section of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. I hired her for a $2,000 retainer, money I pulled from my savings without hesitation. Dr. Chen worked from a small lab in a converted industrial building, a space filled with microscopes, digital imaging equipment, and the quiet hum of electronics. The windows were high and dusty, and the air smelled of toner and cleaning fluid. She was a small woman with steady hands and an encyclopedic knowledge of paper, ink, and pressure patterns. She spoke in a calm, unhurried way, and she asked me to bring the original change form and as many samples of my genuine signature as I could find, old checks, letters, medical forms, the margin notes from my nursing textbooks, even a grocery list I had written years ago. I gathered them from the boxes I had stored, careful not to alter anything. I handed them over in a sealed envelope, and Dr. Chen logged each item into her chain of custody form with the date and time. She spent 2 weeks analyzing everything. I visited her lab twice during that period, watching her work through a glass partition, the way she positioned documents under a video spectral comparator, a machine that could analyze ink composition and reveal layers of writing invisible to the naked eye. She examined the paper under magnification, traced the stroke sequences, measured the slant and loop angles, and compared the pressure patterns using an electrostatic detection apparatus. Her report when it arrived was 27 pages long. I read it at the library, turning the pages with fingers that felt numb. She identified 16 distinct indicators of forgery. The angle of the pen stroke on my supposed signature was inconsistent with my natural writing angle. She had found a 12-degree variance. The spacing between letters was too uniform, a sign of slow, deliberate simulation rather than automatic fluency. The forger had paused at unnatural points, creating microscopic hesitations visible under magnification, what examiners call pen lifts in the middle of letter formations. The letter M in Morris in particular was a dead giveaway. The upstroke and downstroke sequences were completely different from my motor pattern. Dr. Chen had used the video spectral comparator to analyze the ink, confirming it matched the pen type available in the household at the time, a standard blue ballpoint. She also identified tremors in the forger's hand, not the tremors of illness like Alan's, but the tremor of nervousness, a micro-flutter that indicated the writer knew they were committing a crime. The forger, she concluded, was likely a female attempting to simulate another female hand, with a high probability that the writer was familiar with my signature, but unable to reproduce it naturally. The report included magnified photographs showing the differences in minute detail, the way my genuine A closed with a small loop, but the forgery's A had an open top, the way my R had a sharp point at the peak but the forgery's was rounded. Reading it felt like seeing my own life dissected under a microscope. Each indicator was another nail in a coffin I was building. She offered to testify, and I paid her another retainer and added her name to my quiet arsenal. While the legal gears were turning, I continued my undercover observation. Living in the basement had given me a unique perspective, and I used it like a surveillance post. I paid attention to the rhythms of the house above me. Mark's phone calls, which I could hear through the heating duct in my bathroom, had become even more desperate. His voice would rise into a strained, high-pitched register that I had not heard before, and words like foreclosure and asset seizure and bankruptcy petition drifted down like ash. One evening, when I knew they were both at a country club dinner, I decided to search Mark's home office on the second floor. I had been cultivating a skill for moments like this. Years earlier, as a home health nurse, I had cared for a retired locksmith named Walter, a man in his 90s with no family and a lifetime of trade secrets. He had taught me the basics of lockpicking, using tools he made from old street sweeper bristles, and he had given me a small leather case of picks that I kept in my basement closet. Walter had hands that were gnarled with arthritis but still clever, and he used to say that a lock was just a puzzle waiting for the right touch. He had shown me how to use a tension wrench to apply gentle pressure and a rake to manipulate the pins, how to feel for the subtle click of each pin setting, how to listen to the lock as much as feel it. I practiced occasionally on the deadbolts in my own space, learning the technique, and I was not fast, but I was patient. He also gave me a small flashlight that clipped to my collar, and a pair of thin cotton gloves for handling documents, tips that had stayed with me. That evening I climbed the stairs quietly, the house silent except for the hum of central air and the distant tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. I had waited until exactly 7:15 because I knew their dinner reservation was at 7 and they would be gone for at least 2 hours. The office door was usually locked, but tonight it had been left ajar in their haste. I slipped inside. The room smelled of paper and stale cologne. Mark's desk was a disaster. Overdue credit card notices with the red past due stamps, a letter from a collection agency threatening wage garnishment, and a stack of loan applications stamped denied in bold red ink. There were also printouts of emails from investors, people who had put money into his car detailing franchise scheme and were now demanding returns. I read one email that said, "I trusted you with my retirement savings, Mark. Where is my money?" The signature block was from a man in Indiana. Mark was not just drowning, he was pulling others down with him. A filing cabinet in the corner had a simple lever lock, the kind you find on an inexpensive office supply store cabinet. I pulled out my pick set, a tension wrench and a rake made from street sweeper bristles, just as Walter had made for me. I inserted the tension wrench into the keyway and applied gentle pressure, then inserted the rake. I worked the lock slowly, moving the rake back and forth to bounce the pins, feeling for the tiny clicks as each one set. The house was quiet, but every creak of the floorboards made my heart pound in my ears. I forced myself to breathe steadily, the way I did before inserting a difficult Roman 4. It took me about 4 minutes, an eternity when you are terrified of being discovered, but the lock turned with a soft snick. I pulled open the drawer. Inside, in a hanging folder labeled Estate Allen, I found a copy of the beneficiary change form, along with a photocopy of my driver's license from that time, the one with the organ donor symbol I never checked, and a notarized letter purporting to be from me, consenting to the change. The notary stamp was from a woman named Margaret Ellis in Columbus, a name I did not recognize. The letter used language I would never use, phrases like, "I hereby relinquish all claim and irrevocable consent." I photographed every document with my phone, page by page, my hands steady despite the adrenaline. The camera flash was off, but I angled the papers under the desk lamp to capture clear images. Then I replaced everything exactly as I had found it, wiped the cabinet handle with my sleeve to avoid fingerprints, relocked the cabinet, and retreated to my basement. That night I barely slept, but I had the evidence. The copy of my driver's license was especially damning. It had been used to create a fake identity for the notary, and the license number matched mine exactly, proving they had accessed my personal documents. I had one more piece of Alan's puzzle to solve, the combination from his letter. I took the string of numbers and letters to the small regional bank where Alan and I had once opened a joint account. It was a brick building downtown with old-fashioned teller windows, a marble floor that echoed, and a vault door you could see from the lobby. The air smelled of paper and brass polish. I asked the branch manager, a young man with thinning hair and kind eyes named Kevin, if the combination corresponded to a safe deposit box. He checked the records, his fingers tapping on a keyboard that looked out of place in the vintage setting, and confirmed that it did. The box was registered solely to Alan, but he had added a provision that access could be granted to me upon his death with proper identification and the combination. Kevin looked at my driver's license, compared it to the signature card they had on file from when the box was opened, and nodded. He had a calm, respectful manner, and he did not ask unnecessary questions. He led me to the vault, a silent room of polished metal and numbered doors, and I opened the box with trembling fingers. The inner chamber was lined with dark velvet. Inside was a folder. The folder contained a copy of the original life insurance policy with my name as the sole beneficiary, and a notarized statement from Alan dated 2 months before his death. In it, he wrote, "I have reason to believe that my daughter Claire may attempt to interfere with my estate, or convince my wife to sign over assets or insurance benefits. I am of sound mind and not under duress. I want it on record that any change to my life insurance policy made after today's date without my express verbal confirmation to my attorney, Patricia Hammond, should be considered suspect and investigated. My wife Susan Morris is my intended beneficiary and no one else." The notary stamp and signature were from Patricia Hammond herself, which meant Alan had visited her office without telling me, quietly setting his countermeasure in place. He had seen it coming, not the exact contours of the forgery, but the shape of the greed, the trajectory of his daughter's character. He had planted a dead man's switch, a quiet legal bulwark waiting for me to find it. I read the statement 3 times, and each time I felt his presence in the room, his steady hand on my shoulder. I took the folder to Patricia Hammond, who was both shocked and grimly satisfied. She had been Alan's attorney for basic estate planning, but she had not been involved in the beneficiary change which had been processed without her knowledge. She read Alan's statement aloud, her voice quiet but firm, and when she finished she looked at me over her glasses and said, "He was a good man, and he gave us exactly what we need. With the forensic report, the safe deposit box statement, and the photographs from Mark's filing cabinet, she had enough to approach the insurance company formally. She sent a demand letter to Great Lakes Life, alleging fraud and requesting a full internal investigation. The company assigned a compliance officer named Evelyn Torres, a sharp, no-nonsense woman with a clipped Northeast accent who took my information and began her own review. Evelyn and I spoke several times by phone, and she was thorough, asking for every detail I could remember about the period when the change form was processed. She traced the form through their internal processing system and discovered a critical failure. The form had been flagged internally by a junior clerk because the signature did not match the exemplar on file, but a more senior processor had overridden the alert, citing the notary stamp as sufficient. That processor, a woman named Sandra, was later disciplined, and the company tightened its verification procedures as part of the settlement. Evelyn also referred the case to the Ohio Department of Insurance and the local FBI field office because the dollar amount and the interstate nature of the fraud pushed it into federal territory. I received a call from a special agent Warner, a calm, methodical man who asked me to come in for an interview. I did, bringing Patricia with me, and we laid out the evidence again. Agent Warner listened, took notes, and said that they would open an investigation. He told me not to discuss the case with anyone, especially Claire and Mark, and to continue living my life as normal. That was not a problem. I had been living a double life for years. During those months, I continued to live in the basement, playing my role, but the dynamic had shifted. I was no longer a passive victim. I was a collector of evidence, a quiet instrument of reckoning. I observed Claire and Mark's financial chaos with clinical interest, cataloguing the bounced checks and the anguished phone calls, and the increasingly desperate attempts to maintain appearances. I felt no pity, only a cold, clarifying focus. And then I decided to test the absolute depths of their humanity to see if there was anything left to salvage. I staged a medical emergency. It was a Sunday afternoon in October, the light golden and low through the windows, the maple trees in the front yard a blaze of red and orange. The kids were at a friend's house, and Claire and Mark were in the living room watching a football game. I had prepared this moment carefully. I had spent years caring for cardiac patients, and I knew exactly how to simulate a genuine collapse. I practiced in my basement, timing my breathing, learning to hyperventilate just enough to make my face pale without passing out for real. That day I walked upstairs, my face already drained of color from the deliberate breathing, and I stood in the doorway, clutching my chest. I let my body go rigid, my eyes wide with what looked like panic. I staggered forward, gasped, and collapsed onto the living room floor with a loud, resonating thud. I made sure to land in a way that looked uncontrolled but would not actually injure me, my arms splayed, my head turned, my knees buckling first to absorb the impact. I moaned, a low, guttural sound, the kind I had heard from real patients in the ER, a sound that should trigger an immediate response in any person with a pulse. Claire looked up from her phone. She saw me on the floor, my face contorted, my hand reaching out weakly. She said, "Mom, what are you doing?" Her voice was flat, annoyed, as if I were inconveniencing her. Then Mark shouted from the kitchen, "Did she drop the mortgage statement? I need that statement." He had been waiting for a document, a decoy I had deliberately placed in my pocket earlier, a printout of an old tax lien notice I had found in his office. Claire stepped over my body. Her foot passed inches from my outstretched hand, her loafer brushing the carpet near my fingers, and she bent down not to check my pulse or my airway, but to snatch the paper that had fluttered from my pocket when I fell. She handed it to Mark, who grabbed it without a glance at me. I heard him say, "Finally, it's the Fairfield County lien, we can dispute this." They were discussing a potential legal argument while I lay on the floor simulating death. Neither of them called 911. Neither of them knelt down. I lay on that floor for 3 full minutes, my chest rising and falling with simulated distress, and they simply stood there, absorbed in their document and their conversation, discussing whether the lien could be challenged on a technicality. Then I sat up, brushed off my clothes, walked downstairs without a word, and sat on my bed. That night I slept more soundly than I had in years. The last thread of loyalty had been cleanly severed. There was no ambiguity left. I was ready for what came next. The confrontation arrived on a Tuesday evening 3 weeks later. Patricia had called me that afternoon. The insurance company had officially filed a fraud report with the state, and the bank had frozen a joint account pending a review. Claire and Mark had been notified by their branch, and they were in a state of panic. They knew something was closing in, and it did not take them long to connect the dots to me. Around 7 o'clock they came down to the basement. The knock on my door was not a knock, it was a pounding, a fist against the hollow wood that rattled the frame. I opened the door and there they were. Claire's face was blotchy with rage, her carefully composed facade shattered, her hair dishevelled, and Mark stood behind her with his jaw clenched and his fists at his sides. "What did you do?" Claire hissed. "What did you tell the insurance company? They froze our accounts, Susan. Did you think we wouldn't figure it out?" Her voice was a trembling blade. I did not back away. I looked at her, this woman I had raised, and I said quietly, "I found the tax form. Claire, the $1,099 from the policy you stole. I know you forged my signature." Her eyes flickered, just for an instant, a micro-expression of fear, and then hardened. "You have no proof," she spat. "You never had proof of anything. That was always your problem." Mark added, his voice low and threatening, "You need to retract whatever you told them. Tell them it was a mistake, that you were confused, or we will make your life very difficult." He stepped forward, close enough that I could smell his cologne, a heavy, cloying scent that reminded me of cheap air freshener. I did not move. I stood in my basement doorway, the hum of the mini-fridge behind me, and I said, "You already have my signature. The one you forged. Why would I give you another?" Claire's face went pale and she opened her mouth to say something, but the sound of tires on gravel interrupted us. Outside, 3 black SUVs had pulled into the driveway, their engines idling for a moment before cutting off. Federal agents in suits, accompanied by a county sheriff's deputy, moved toward the house with a search warrant in hand. The lead agent was Special Agent Warner, the calm, methodical professional who had interviewed me. He knocked on the front door, and when no one answered, he used a key the sheriff had obtained from the property records. The basement was not far from the main entrance, and I heard the footsteps overhead, heavy and purposeful. Claire and Mark heard them too, and their expressions shifted from fury to confusion to dawning horror. The agents swept through the house, securing the premises, and they found us in the basement. Agent Warner looked at me, then at Claire and Mark, and said, "Mr. and Mrs. Bates, you are being placed under investigation for conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering. Please step outside." Claire screamed, "This is her fault, she's lying." But Warner was unmoved. Mark's face went slack and he seemed to shrink, his bluster evaporating. An agent read them their rights and they were led out in handcuffs. I followed, a silent spectator, watching the lights of the SUVs reflect off the windows of the house I had once cleaned and maintained as a servant. It was over. Not with a scream or a fight, but with the quiet, efficient machinery of the law. The weeks that followed were a cascade of legal consequences. Claire and Mark were arrested and charged. Their assets were frozen, and the house, which they owned with a mortgage already underwater due to their years of overspending, went into foreclosure when they could no longer make payments. The FBI uncovered a broader pattern of investor fraud. Mark had been running a Ponzi scheme disguised as a car detailing franchise, promising returns to investors and using new money to pay old obligations. The trial was long and painful, stretching over months, but the evidence was overwhelming. Dr. Leela Chen testified for hours, walking the jury through her 27-page report with the precision of a surgeon. She projected magnified images of my genuine signature next to the forgery, and she pointed out each of the 16 indicators, explaining motor patterns and pen pressure and stroke sequences in a way that even the most technical phrase was made clear. The jury saw the forgery plainly, and I saw several jurors nodding as she spoke. Then Patricia read Allen's safe deposit box statement into the record, and a hush fell over the courtroom. The combination of his prescient warning and the forensic proof was devastating. Claire, facing a mountain of evidence, eventually pleaded guilty to the insurance fraud charge. She was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. Mark, whose broader scheme of defrauding investors and laundering money through his car detailing business was unraveled by the FBI, received 8 years. Their marriage dissolved during the trial, a small, bitter footnote, divorce papers filed from a detention center. Diane, who had testified in Claire's defense, claiming I was a spiteful, jealous woman who had manipulated Allen, was left with nothing but a ruined reputation and a daughter behind bars. The court ordered restitution of $300,000 to me, but since Claire and Mark had no liquid assets, the judgment would be satisfied through the sale of their property. Their house went to auction in December. I went to that auction, a cold morning with frost glittering on the grass, the courthouse steps crowded with a few indifferent speculators. Patricia stood beside me in a wool coat. I had prepared a cashier's check for $120,000, drawn from my savings, and a small bridge loan Patricia helped me arrange against the expected restitution. The bidding was sparse because the house had a cloud on the title and needed significant repairs. The roof was leaking, the furnace was failing, and I won. The auctioneer's gavel came down, and the deed was transferred into my name, free and clear, on a Tuesday morning under a pale winter sun. I now owned the house where I had been a servant, the roof that had sheltered their greed. I repaired it slowly, methodically, fixing the roof shingles, painting the water-stained walls, replacing the worn carpets with simple laminate flooring. I turned it into a modest rental property, planting new shrubs out front and repainting the mailbox. And then Diane called me. Her voice, which I had not heard directly in a decade, was cracked and desperate. She had no place to live. Her daughter was in prison, her son-in-law was in federal custody, and her credit was destroyed by association. She needed a room, and she had heard I owned the house. I told her I had a furnished basement suite available with a kitchenette and a private entrance. The rent was $900 a month, utilities included. She cried, a sound that gave me no pleasure, but she agreed. She signed the lease, and every month on the 1st, she places a check in my mailbox. I take that check to the bank and deposit it into an account that funds a scholarship for nursing students at the community college, the same one I attended. I do not spend a single cent of that rent on myself. It goes to young women and men who are working nights, packing their lunches in Tupperware, and sacrificing for a future they believe in. The scholarship is named the Alan Morris Memorial Scholarship, and each recipient receives a letter explaining that the award was made possible by a woman who believed in second chances and the long, patient arc of truth. I sign each letter by hand, carefully, using the same signature that someone once tried to steal and failed. The aftermath of all this is not a story of heart revenge. Revenge burns bright and quick and leaves scorched earth. What I waged was a cold, patient, meticulous war of evidence and procedure, the same way I managed a cardiac crisis: monitor, diagnose, intervene. Alan saw the danger and left me a map, a letter, a box, a combination. His quiet countermeasures were the foundation of everything. I live now in a small one-bedroom apartment, walking distance from the public library, in a neighborhood where the trees are old and the rent is reasonable. I have a container garden on the balcony where I grow cherry tomatoes and basil, and I pack my lunches in the same Tupperware containers I have always used, the ones my mother used before me. Every month when Diane's check arrives, I place it in a locked drawer next to the key to Alan's wooden box, and I feel a quiet, steady peace. The people who tried to take everything from me ended up giving me the instruments of their own undoing, and now their wealth, what little remained of it, goes to build futures for strangers who remind me of myself 40 years ago. That is not revenge, that is restoration. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? I want to hear your stories in the comments below. Thank you for watching until the end. If you believe that truth is a patient weapon and that the quiet ones eventually speak the loudest, please hit like and subscribe. It helps more than you know. I will be back soon with another story. Take care of yourselves and trust the evidence.